Virtual students, we're going to begin talking about Old Modern English, which is Shakespeare and the Shakespearean and the Elizabethan theater. So I will post this PowerPoint on Google Classrooms for you guys. All right, so this is a pretty long, we will probably not get through all of this today because it's fairly long. We start out talking about more like a Shakespeare. We talk about the time period also and what was going on in England and in Europe during this time. So Shakespeare's language, a mix of old and very new. And by the way, and we'll see some examples, little known fact, or a lot of people don't realize this, but a lot of terms that we use now came from Shakespeare. So lots of use of rural and urban words and images. Because we're now talking about, in England, we're talking about London and the areas surrounding London. So, when we talk about the Elizabethan theater, which is Elizabethan theater is where the Shakespearean plays were performed, we're talking about urban areas, so in the city. His work, it was understandable, still would be, by the lowest peasant and the highest noble. So Shakespeare's work it crossed all boundaries, and it was written in such a way that anyone and everyone could enjoy it. Lots of interesting things. We'll get into them a little bit later, maybe tomorrow when we get into the Shakespearean or Elizabethan, theater. There's some kind of interesting things about who attended those plays, those Shakespearean plays. How many words did he use? 30,000. So, language at this point was still very new. The English language, still very new. And so, words, there were still a lot of words, new words that were being developed and were being used. And like I said just a moment ago, some words and some phrases that we still use even today can be attributed to Shakespeare. So I guess the implication here would be that Shakespeare used more words than most people, as far as vocabulary, than I guess most people have or use today. The language of love. In Shakespeare's time, everyone loved the English language. There were no grammar rules, punctuation keys, or spelling. So during this time period, again, because the language was still new, so you didn't really have punctuation per se. All that kind of came along later, and didn't necessarily have grammar rules. The spelling, and that's probably one of the things that you'll notice if you look at untranslated, and a lot of what we'll see. In fact, I think the poems and such, the sonnets in the Norton would be the modern, the old modern, and so you'll notice that some of the words are spelled differently. They're close enough that you'll be able to tell what the word is. It's a word that probably is still used, but you will definitely see a spelling difference. You should remember to get all this.
I was about to ask.
Yeah, I've got it right here. Don't let me forget. Or classes over. So the language was still evolving, and every day new words were being made up. So Shakespeare's language reflects this experimentation and this freedom to use language in different ways and to make up words and sort of thing. I mean, there's new words added to the dictionary every year. They'll come out with this list. And a lot of them are kind of urban slang or words like that or find their way into the dictionary because they do become a part of language or our language and they're used on a regular basis. I'm trying to think of some. Does anybody think of some that's come out?
Yeah.
Huh?
Selfie was.
What word?
Selfie? Like self picture?
Oh, selfie. Yes. I bet that is one. Yes.
I know that catfish, like the term catfish, got added because like this one he's on the end of the stars. He's the reason catfish got added.
What does that mean?
It means like, okay, so someone pretends to be someone else and like
social media.
talks, on social media.
Okay.
Like catfish.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know that back during, this was before y'all were born, but back during, the, when you had like, Silicon Valley and, all this with, Microsoft and Dell computers and AMD and all these, so, that whole tech bubble and when all that was going on back in the 90s, you had quite a few words that were added to the dictionary that were techie, well, that's probably one there, techie. But they, had to do with technology and, social media that was just then starting to kind of come up and, having some prominence and people started using them and this sort of thing. So I know back then there were a lot of new words that came up. Yeah, well, yeah, we don't use that one as much anymore, but in my day, I used to work on floppy disks. Yeah, when I first went to work, this is before I went to college. Well, I was going to college during that time. The first time I went to college, several times anyway. I worked for this accounting firm, and they had these big, huge. We had like little smaller computers, kind of like this, except it was kind of an all-in-one thing. But they had these huge computers that would take up like, one whole room. And they used these big, huge floppy disks. And that's where they saved the information. So it was like the clients that they would do their tax returns and they would do financial statements for them and all this sort of thing. They would save all that information on these big floppy disks. And so they would be labeled with who the client was. Usually we do them like alphabetically so we could find them easily. And you would store those. And you had to be real careful where you store them. Because if they got hot, like you would want to, keep them out in your car in July here in Southeast Texas because it would destroy them. The data would be compromised and this kind of thing. And so you couldn't also, this was another thing, you had to be real careful. They weren't supposed to be anything that was magnetized, because it could erase them. And so they would these big disks, and it's just crazy how far things have come now. But I'm telling you, those computers, because we had two big, huge ones, and they were just huge, and that room would get really, really hot because of those computers, I mean, it's just so different. And my goodness, it really hasn't been that many years ago. I mean, gosh, probably 30, 35 years ago. Oh, no, we didn't have any of that.
And then all of a sudden, we've got all of this technology.
Oh, yeah, I mean, it is.
It trips me out. I don't understand it.
It's absolutely amazing. And I can remember when we first started, actually had internet. And not to get off too much on all this, but when I used to be a court reporter, and when I first started court reporting, you didn't have the internet. And so we needed to look up terms or, there were things like that. We just had to have a certain type. Like I had all these different dictionaries. I had a maritime dictionary because we took lots of maritime. The attorneys I take depositions for, they did a lot of maritime law. And so there was all these weird, terms that the average Joe, including myself, wasn't familiar with. So you had all these different kinds of dictionaries like that. So we could, could look things up. It wasn't like now where you got the internet. All you have to do is just type in a word and there it is, meaning and spelling and all that. So it was a totally different world. I can remember when cell phones first came out. And I got my first cell phone was, I had been a court reporter for probably a couple of years. And so the old fashioned way for them to call and give, to give you, like the company I worked for, to give me a deposition to take the next day was they would just leave it on my answering machine at home. They don't even have those anymore, and so it's crazy. We didn't say something.
Well, it's just weird times, like when I was a kid, I didn't have a phone, so like I just had, my parents had to trust me no matter where I went.
Yeah.
Like I can't walk out of the house without getting a lecture about where I'm supposed to be.
Yeah.
And they have an active tracker. And they
Yeah.
still trust me, so I don't understand how they're really trusting now.
Well, I mean, I think back to that and like, when I was growing up, I mean, we didn't have cell phones or anything like that. And my parents, I mean, they just had to trust that I'd be home at 12:02.
The world
Because I was always like, 12:02, but I think now it really would be a scary thing because, I have a son that's just about to turn 21 and I think, my goodness, if I didn't have a cell phone or he didn't have one, I'd be worried, really worried all the time, not being able
Yeah,
to.
it's like, I feel like the world's just way worse now.
Well, it is. It's a lot worse than when I was growing up in y'all's age. There's no doubt about that. Okay, so iambic pentameter. I'm sure you've heard of that before. So this is how Shakespearean sonnets generally are written using iambic pentameter. So that's actually a lot of poems that we read or that you might read oftentimes are written in iambic pentameter. So they definitely have like a meter and a rhyme scheme and this sort of thing. So, they're kind of got a rhythm going to them. So iambic pentameter actually means a sound pattern. So it's going to be one unaccented syllable with one accented. So that's all about where the stress falls on the word or maybe a syllable of a word in a line. So much like a heartbeat, ba-boom, ba-boom, ba-boom. So unaccented and then an accented. So 5 babooms in a row make one line of iambic pentameter. That would be the 10-syllable line. So look at probably so much easier to just write through verse. When we get into American literature, we'll be reading some Walt Whitman, who was really kind of considered to be the father of free verse. So Walt Whitman, you don't really have so much with meter and rhyme scheme. He had a few poems. One of them is Beat Beat Drum, which is really cool, and it very much has a set rhythm to it because it's supposed to be mimicking like the beating of drums, and it's part of his Civil War poetry, which is really beautiful. But my husband was talking about the other day because he's teaching American Lit class this semester at Lamar, and he was talking about it's been a while since he read or taught Whitman. He said, I didn't remember him being so gloomy and dark, and he's kind of like the British romantic poets we'll be covering pretty soon. None of them are happy, kind of like the Viking poetry, I guess. They're kind of dark and gloomy and downers. Yeah, so here's an example. He went to town today to buy a car. I need to continue. Or, in sooth, I know not why I am so sad.
It's too complicated to write something like that. I've never.
Well, I think it would be very difficult. Poetry has never been my thing. I have friends that write beautiful poetry. There's one, she teaches over now at Lamar, and she's got about 4. She's young, she's not even 30 yet. She has like 4 books of poetry published, and I mean, it's just beautiful, but it's very different from this. It's not, it's more free verse, and this is really beautiful, but that would not, that wouldn't be my thing. All right, so using iambic pentameter kept things moving in the play. So if you think about, y'all are gonna be looking at, what we're gonna be talking about really with Shakespeare is gonna be his sonnets. We're not gonna read any of his plays, but, if you're a junior this year, probably next year, you'll be taking Mrs. Quartz's AP4 class, and she does, I think, usually at least one Shakespearean play, maybe two.
She was like mythology.
Yes, I think that's how she starts out her semester at Brit Lit.
Yeah, the brother's in the class right now.
Oh, yeah, Ethan. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So y'all will enjoy that class. That's her thing is, Shakespeare. She's really, really knowledgeable, when it comes to, especially the Shakespearean plays. They all enjoy that. But anyway, so back to the Shakespearean plays. So to write and have the plays written and using like an iambic pentameter, it kept things moving. Because, you wouldn't want to get too bogged down, I guess, when you're writing a play or when you're performing a play. It made the words and play more interesting. And it also helped the actors to remember their lines. So that makes sense. They're almost like a song, so they could more easily memorize their lines. Oops, sorry. I'll put this up on Google Classroom also, so don't listen a little bit. All right, when Shakespeare set his words to iambic pentameter, it is compared to the birth of rock and roll. So, by the way, Shakespeare was a big deal in England, and he became well known pretty much all over the world, certainly Europe and, America. But he was like a, rock star, and so everybody wanted to go and see a Shakespearean play. But he was considered to be very, very progressive for this time period. In Shakespeare's, by the way, there is his signature. This is really interesting. In Shakespeare's time, you only had one copy of a play, and after you wrote it for the acting company, you no longer owned it. So you lost all rights to your work once you gave it to an acting company. Scripts were thrown out when they were no longer wanted or needed, which is also interesting. So there are no copies of Shakespeare's plays in his own handwriting that have survived. The only known evidence of anything in his handwriting is that signature on the plays for Thomas More that Shakespeare might have written. So, there's a lot of questions, there's been a lot of controversy about who really was Shakespeare. And I'd say in the last 10, 15, 20 years, there's actually been a lot of historians, and there's actually, well, he's not out there now, but he was when I was there. He retired for a long time ago, but he was a British Lit professor at Lamar in the English department, and he was a extremely well-known and published Shakespearean um, uh, historian, and he had this theory, and he had actually published this in this paper and had presented it at some different conferences and all, that it was some other man that was actually writing these Shakespearean plays, and that it wasn't really the person, it wasn't actually Shakespeare. So more or less, Shakespeare had a ghostwriter, I guess you could say. So I don't know. That's just was kind of, he had all this, these ideas, and I mean, it was through research. He didn't just dream this up. He had research that was supporting his idea of who this person was. But anyway, there's been a lot of the last couple of decades, I guess, questioning of, did Shakespeare actually write his own work, and who really was Shakespeare, and lots of controversy and all about the real Shakespeare. All right, let's talk about quartos. So quartos are small books of published plays. The first the first published works of Shakespeare's vary considerably from the size of his plays. Scholars believe these are faulty versions, calling them bad quartos. There might have been some he didn't really mean to be published, or oops, sorry. Notice how they spell Shakespeare up here. Isn't that weird?
Can you go back
Victory.
real quick? I'll take a picture and go.
Oh, go back.
Okay.
So that's kind of funny. At this time, I guess the S was often replaced if it was in the middle of a word with like an F or an F sound. So these, the histories of Shakespeare. The first full collection of Shakespeare's work was published in 1623, so 7 years after his death. It was called the First Folio, and it contained 36 plays compiled by these two men, John Hemingway and Henry Condell, who were friends and fellow actors of Shakespeare. By the way, Shakespeare was an actor as well. But once he started writing his plays, I don't think he acted as much anymore, but he actually kind of started out more, at least the person they think is Shakespeare, was more of an actor at first, and he started writing.
Was it only like men who played in plays?
Yep, we're going to talk about that too. Yeah, women were not allowed to act in this time period. Who do you think that they used for female parts? Young, usually it was young, very young men, or boys, even young teenage boys that they would dress up and they would act the roles of the females. All right, now let's talk a little bit about the Elizabethan theatrical convention. So the Elizabethan theater, does anybody know why it's called the Elizabethan theater, which is where Shakespeare's plays were performed? That's right, the first Queen Elizabeth, that's exactly right. So she was a huge fan of Shakespeare. And so she liked to see his plays, and so it became known and then as the Elizabethan Theater. So here we go, Bailey. The actors were all men, and young boys would play the female parts. Yes.
Are you gonna put this PowerPoint in Google Classroom?
So this is interesting how this theater life worked back then. If you were an actor, you were considered to be like a shareholder in the theater. So you had to, you had to kind of come up with, along with the other members of the theater, the other actors, like your own set designs and costumes and this sort of thing. Of course, set design, I use that term sparingly because a set design might be nothing more than a curtain in the back and maybe like a table, a chair or something like that. I mean, that was pretty much the extent for the most part of set design. But if you were an actor, you had, kind of you were a shareholder. So you got part of the money that was brought in from ticket sales or when people would, pay to get in to see the play or whatever. So it was in the interest of these actors to bring in more people because that's how they got paid, essentially. So if they didn't do well, there weren't many people coming in and they didn't get any money. Now, well, I think it was more just at that time period, just women weren't supposed to, they didn't really have much in the way of roles outside of the home. And it was more really, I think, because of that. So their pay depended on admission sales. This is not interesting too. Actors only had about 3 weeks to practice a new play. Which if you think about it, and the Shakespearean plays are long. So to think about, unless you had a fairly short role or a small part, to think about, think Romeo and Juliet. Did y'all kind of Romeo and Juliet in this one? So that's a fairly, those of you that did, that's a pretty long play. Can you imagine being Romeo or Juliet and having to memorize all those lines in 3 weeks? In 1 week, the troops may perform 6 different plays. That's a lot. Can you imagine that? Oh, I don't think I'd be doing too well. I forget words as it is. I can imagine trying to memorize all that.
Well, it's a little bit different because you kind of memorize different lines.
Yeah, well, and that's, again, that kind of goes back to why, a lot of them, the plays are set to iambic pentameter because it's almost song-like. So it made it easier for the actors to memorize their lines. They didn't have a lot of time to practice and memorize.
In American Lit, when we talk about how documents were written, that's how they word stuff on the Declaration of Independence and stuff. So
We don't really get into that, the Declaration of Independence. No, I mean, we could, but,
you don't talk about the way they wrote, they have weird words in that.
well, we don't really do that. We start with John Smith, Captain John Smith, and actually, we will read some of his, accounts of, landing, in Virginia. Anyway, and we'll read some of his, so he used, some of the words he used were kind of unknown to us, and different spellings and all that. That's about the extent of it. Okay, a little bit more about Elizabethan theater. Okay, so just some things that they had to deal with that, could be problematic. They, of course, obviously didn't have electricity. The women were forbidden to act in the plays. That, well, I kind of already mentioned this, but they were very minimalistic, with set designs and, that kind of thing. Even their clothes that they wore and all would be pretty simplistic, nothing elaborate. Okay, so these are some theatrical, well, I'm going to say gimmicks, but things that they would often do in the play. So a soliloquy. What is a soliloquy? You remember what that is, maybe? Because there were some, maybe, I'm trying to think, a couple, maybe, in Romeo and Juliet, if you've read that. So that would be when one actor would give a pretty long, almost kind of like a speech. So, yes, kind of like a monologue, something similar to that. And then an aside would be when an actor would maybe almost like come outside of the play or outside of the person that they were portraying in the play, and they would give some information like to the audience. Kind of like some, well, this is what was going on, during the time, and, so like maybe some background information or some information that the audience would need to know. So these are things that you would oftentimes see in a Shakespearean play, and lots of blood. People in this time period, they liked bloody theater. And really not, I guess, Romeo and Juliet, not so much, but Macbeth is extremely violent. Julius Caesar, extremely violent. Anyway, so they love to see violence and blood. So some of his plays do contain that. And oftentimes, maybe the use of supernatural. So Macbeth, there's a use of supernatural. Not so much. I think Taming of the Shrew has some use of supernatural. Don't believe there was really any in Romeo and Juliet. I don't think. I remember that there was off the top of my head. But people love that kind of thing in this time period.
And Romeo and Juliet, whenever she drinks the potions and the rain that she's dead, is that not supernatural? Is that it's magic, I guess? That came from someone living like that?
Magic is
Yeah, I wouldn't call that supernatural. Supernatural would be more like in Macbeth, they see ghosts. the main, protagonist would see ghosts and spirits of other people that they had known and this kind of thing. That would come talking. I would call that more of a supernatural. I don't think Romeo and Juliet had any supernatural that I can remember. So we'll make sure I'm getting them. Oh, okay. So soliloquy, just to give y'all a better, this is better. That's actually more, it can be when somebody's talking, it's just that person, but there actually would be maybe sharing their thoughts with the audience. Okay, so that's gonna be more a soliloquy. That's how it would be different from a monologue, is where it would be actually just one person talking like in a long speech or what have you. But a soliloquy may be that as well, that the person is telling their thoughts to the audience. All right, so oftentimes in Shakespearean plays, you had the use of disguises, so there'd be mistaken identity. Well, there was that in Romeo and Juliet. Do y'all remember that part? Those of you that, so Romeo goes to a party that is given by Juliet's family, and of course, they're having this big, huge conflict of families, and so obviously he's not supposed to be there. They would be very unhappy, and might try to harm him or something. But he wants to go to the party, so he goes with a mask, and a lot of them are wearing masks. So anyway, he's nobody realizes that he's Romeo. So anyway, oftentimes have the use of disguises, which could lead to mistaken identity. The last speaker in a tragedy would be the highest in rank. So, meaning the most important character in the play would have maybe the last line, at least like in the tragedies. So again, in tragedies, oftentimes there'd be multiple murders. So there were several murders in Romeo and Juliet. And oftentimes multiple marriages in the comedy. So like Taming of the Shrew is a comedy. Don't remember off the top of my head others, but anyway. Shakespeare. The Merchant of Venice. I think what's going on with me? Oh, King Lear. But I guess Taming of the Shrew would probably be the one that's the most well known of his comedies. All right, I tell you what, why don't we leave it at that? We only have about 3 minutes left, and we're almost done anyway. We'll go into more of a biography of Shakespeare. We'll also go over some of what's going to maybe review a little bit for the test. No, we just starting this. So. Okay. Huh? Yeah. Right, yeah,
Making that look not stiff, if that makes any sense.
right.
Now that I'm working on like animatics, so I have to learn how to do something.
Right. Oh, that is so cool. You might decide that you really want to go into that as a career.
I don't know.
Well, this is good that you're getting this opportunity to try it out, you know, and
Yeah,
see if you like it.
I just kind of thought like, see, in animation one, our teacher was required to teach us a lot of tech stuff and not actual animation stuff.
Yes, right.
And so I just kind of taken it upon myself to teach myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I looked up like how to make an animatic and how to make storyboard. There are a couple of videos on storyboards. The thing is, there's no right way to do it.
Right.
So basically, I watched a couple videos on how other people make animatics and storyboards, and then I just go into it.
Wow.
So,
That's very cool, Savannah.
yeah,
Really
I'm
is.
on like my third or fourth one right now that I'm working on. So,
That's excellent. That is really cool. Very cool.
anyway.
All right, see you tomorrow. Bye-bye. Sorry, I'll let this run. Got to turn it off.